The bystander effect. Nobody moved. Imagine screaming for help while dozens of eyes turn toward you, yet nobody moves. Your voice shakes, your chest tightens, and time feels distorted, stretching into slow, unbearable moments as you watch people stand still as if frozen in place, trapped between uncertainty and fear. You study their faces, desperate for even the smallest flicker of courage. A step forward, a raised hand, a voice calling for help. But instead, you find blank stares, nervous glances, and the subtle shifting of weight from one foot to the other, the body's physical expression of psychological retreat. It's not because they want to see you suffer, and it's not because they're heartless or cruel. In fact, many of them feel an overwhelming urge to help, but don't know how to turn that impulse into action. Each person assumes someone else in the group must know better, must be more capable, more confident, more responsible. Each one quietly tells themselves, someone else will handle it. Someone else is already calling. Someone else will step in first. And as this invisible chain of assumption spreads through the crowd, responsibility dissolves like smoke, leaving everyone watching and no one acting. Inside you, panic grows. Inside them, doubt grows. They fear misreading the situation, embarrassing themselves, making the wrong decision, or becoming the center of attention in a moment charged with uncertainty. So they remain still, hoping that staying silent is safer than risking a mistake. This silent, chilling moment, where instinct collides with hesitation and the need for help meets a wall of collective inaction, perfectly captures the essence of one of the most disturbing psychological phenomena ever discovered. A flaw not in individuals but in groups, a weakness that emerges only when people are together. The bystander effect. What exactly is the bystander effect? The bystander effect describes a paradox. The more people who witness an emergency, the less likely any individual is to intervene. It's counterintuitive, almost absurd at first glance. How can more eyes, more hands, more potential helpers result in less action? We grow up believing that being surrounded by others makes us safer, that danger pulls people together, that a crowd is a shield rather than a barrier. Movies, stories, and cultural myths teach us that heroes rise when the stakes are high, that someone always steps forward. But human psychology reveals a far darker, more uncomfortable truth. When responsibility is shared among many people, it becomes diluted for each individual, thinned out until it feels almost non-existent. Each person assumes the burden belongs to someone else, someone braver, someone more experienced, someone who surely must be reacting already. In a crowd, the mind whispers, they'll handle it. Someone must be handling it. And so, by expecting action from others, everyone quietly excuses themselves from acting at all. When everyone is responsible, no one feels responsible. This unsettling reality, this hidden flaw in group behavior, remained mostly unknown to the public until it was violently thrust into mainstream awareness by one tragic night in New York City, a night that exposed just how dangerous this psychological blind spot can be. The story that shocked America. On March 13, 1964, 28-year-old Catherine Kitty Genovese was returning home to her apartment in Queens after a late shift. It was a routine walk she had taken many times before, a short distance from her car to the safety of her building. But on this night, a man who had been watching her stepped from the shadows and followed her toward the entrance. Just outside her building, under the dim street lights and the echo of her footsteps, he attacked her. Kitty's screams shattered the quiet of the neighborhood. "Please help me. I'm dying." Her voice carried through the windows of nearby apartments, through the still air of early morning, through the thin walls of a city that never truly sleeps. According to early media reports, 38 people saw or heard parts of the attack, yet almost no one stepped in or called the police. The idea that dozens of witnesses remained silent spread across the country like wildfire, horrifying the nation. Television hosts, newspapers, and ordinary citizens asked the same haunting question: how could so many people stand by as a young woman was murdered? Later investigations revealed that the 38 witnesses claim was exaggerated. Some people heard something vague, some misinterpreted the noise, and some were unaware of how serious the situation was. But these corrections didn't erase the core truth. Multiple people realized something was wrong, and almost none took action. Whether it was 10 witnesses or 30, the outcome was the same. In a moment where one life hung in the balance, the crowd failed to respond. This night exposed a psychological blind spot that society had long ignored, a moment where human instincts collided with social paralysis. It forced psychologists to confront a question many people didn't want to face. Why do ordinary, decent individuals become passive observers in moments of crisis? Why does a crowd, which should represent safety, so often transform into a wall of silence? The search for those answers would uncover one of the most unsettling truths about human behavior. Myth and reality. The exact number of witnesses doesn't change the deeper message of the case. Whether it was a handful of people or dozens scattered behind windows and curtains, the psychological pattern remains the same. Some people genuinely misunderstood what they heard. A scream in the night can be mistaken for an argument, a prank, or even a drunken outburst in a busy city. Others assume that someone else must have already reacted, convinced that a neighbor closer to the commotion had surely called the police. And then there were those who simply froze, paralyzed not by indifference but by uncertainty, caught in that uncomfortable space between concern and doubt, unsure whether stepping in would help, escalate the situation, or put themselves in danger. But the most important insight remains. Humans often hesitate not because they are cruel, but because they are confused and deeply influenced by the behavior of those around them. When a person looks outside and sees no one else reacting, they interpret that stillness as a signal that things might not be as serious as they seem. This silent social echo, where one person's inaction reinforces another's, spreads through a group like a psychological chain reaction. The Kitty Genovese tragedy exposed a flaw in human decision-making that doesn't emerge when people are alone, but becomes powerful and dangerous in groups. It revealed a hidden vulnerability in how crowds behave under pressure, a vulnerability that can turn ordinary, well-meaning people into passive observers at the exact moment when action is needed most. Why people don't react. Diffusion of responsibility. Researchers identified 3 powerful psychological mechanisms behind the bystander effect, and the first is known as diffusion of responsibility. When you are the only witness to an emergency, the situation feels painfully clear. If you don't act, no one will. The burden of responsibility sits squarely on your shoulders, and that clarity often forces action. But when you are surrounded by others, that sense of responsibility becomes diluted. Every additional witness becomes an excuse for the mind to step back. People subconsciously assume that someone else in the group is more qualified, more confident, or already taking care of things. The result is a strange mental escape hatch, a quiet reassurance that someone else will handle it. even when nobody actually does. In a crowd, responsibility doesn't disappear all at once. It slowly spreads so thinly across everyone present that it becomes almost weightless, allowing each person to step away from action without feeling personally guilty. And in that psychological vacuum, the group becomes a collection of individuals waiting for others to lead, while no one actually steps forward. Pluralistic ignorance. The second mechanism is pluralistic ignorance, a deeply human tendency to look to others when we are uncertain about how to interpret a situation, when something ambiguous happens, a shout, a crash, a cry for help. People instinctively scan the faces around them for cues on how to react. If the crowd looks calm, your mind concludes that the situation must not be serious, even if your instincts whisper otherwise. But here's the trap. Everyone else is doing the same thing. Each person is silently checking the reactions of others, and because nobody wants to stand out, everyone acts calm, composed, and uncertain all at once. This creates a loop of silent uncertainty that spreads through the group like a psychological fog, convincing each person that maybe they're overreacting, maybe they're misinterpreting what they heard, maybe it's safer to do nothing. And as this loop deepens, it becomes harder and harder for anyone to break free from the illusion that everything is fine. Pluralistic ignorance traps the entire group in a shared state of hesitation, where every second of inaction feels justified simply because nobody else is moving either. Fear of judgment. The third force behind the bystander effect is fear of judgment, a subtle but powerful form of social pressure. Many people hesitate not because they don't care, but because they are terrified of making the wrong decision in front of others. They worry about overreacting, misreading the situation, or drawing unwanted attention to themselves. The thought of becoming the center of a scene, even for a good reason, can feel overwhelming. In modern society where people are often judged, recorded, and criticized, the instinct to appear calm, rational, and in control becomes stronger than the instinct to help. Someone might think, what if I rush over and it turns out to be nothing? Or, what if I try to help and make things worse? Or even, I don't want strangers staring at me. This fear of embarrassment, combined with the desire to maintain social composure, can override even the most urgent moral impulses. Together, these three psychological forces, the scattering of responsibility, the confusion created by others' inaction, and the fear of public misjudgment, merge into the perfect psychological storm, a storm strong enough to halt an entire crowd at the very moment when action is most needed. The experiment that revealed the truth. Driven by the Genovese case, psychologists John Darley and Bib Latane conducted groundbreaking experiments to uncover the hidden mechanisms behind human inaction. One of their most famous studies placed participants in separate rooms, each one believing they were part of a group discussion conducted over an intercom system. The setup felt harmless, ordinary, even slightly boring, until suddenly, one of the participants in another room began to sound distressed. His voice trembled, he gasped for air, and then he began to fake a full seizure, choking and pleading for help. The cries were impossible to ignore. The real participants listened as the situation escalated into what sounded like a life-threatening emergency. But here is where the experiment revealed something extraordinary. When a person believed they were the only witness, 85% of them acted almost immediately, rushing out to find the experimenter or trying to contact someone for help. Yet when they believed other people were also listening, when the responsibility felt shared, that number collapsed to 31%. The danger was exactly the same. The cries for help were exactly the same. Nothing changed except the number of perceived witnesses. And that single variable was powerful enough to alter human behavior dramatically. This experiment proved what the Genovese case had suggested. When people think responsibility is shared, the mind enters a state of psychological paralysis, waiting for someone else to make the first move. It showed, with scientific precision, that the presence of others doesn't increase safety. It can actually smother the instinct to act. The modern form of the bystander effect. In the age of smartphones and constant recording, the bystander effect has evolved into something even more complex and, in many ways, more dangerous. When a crisis unfolds today, many people instinctively reach for their phones, not to call for help, but to film what's happening in front of them. The simple act of holding up a camera creates the illusion of participation, as if documenting the moment counts as doing something meaningful. But recording is the opposite of action. It freezes the observer in a passive role, giving them a false sense of involvement while offering no actual assistance to the person who needs it. In large crowds, at concerts, protests, busy streets, festivals, or stadiums, responsibility becomes so diluted that it practically evaporates. Each person assumes that someone else is calling for help, someone else is stepping in, someone else is taking charge. Meanwhile, dozens of phones are raised in the air, capturing the moment from every angle, transforming a human emergency into a potential viral clip. We have turned witnessing into content, and in doing so, we've numbed our instinct to intervene. The more people record, the more detached they feel from the urgency of the situation, and the more they observe instead of act. In this modern version of the bystander effect, technology doesn't just reflect inaction, it reinforces it, creating a society where documentation often replaces responsibility, and where the impulse to help is overshadowed by the impulse to film. Breaking the bystander effect. Despite how powerful the bystander effect is, psychology offers ways to overcome it, and these strategies are surprisingly simple yet incredibly effective. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you need help, the worst thing you can do is shout to the entire crowd, because a crowd has no face, no identity, and no sense of personal responsibility. Instead, you must anchor your plea to a single individual. Point directly at one person, make eye contact, and give a clear instruction. You call the police. In that moment, responsibility transforms from something vague and shared into something personal and undeniable. When responsibility becomes personal, the paralysis shatters. People respond far more quickly when they feel they have been chosen, when the call to action is directed specifically at them, when they can no longer hide behind the anonymity of the group. And if you witness an emergency, the key is to take the first step. Speak clearly, act decisively, and show through your behavior that intervention is possible. Human beings are social creatures. We take cues from the actions of others, especially in moments of uncertainty. One person's courage often unlocks the courage of everyone else, breaking the psychological barrier that holds crowds frozen. A single voice saying, "I'll help," can transform an entire group from passive observers into active responders. In a way, the cure for the bystander effect begins with one brave individual willing to take responsibility when no one else will. A question that matters. After every tragedy shaped by the bystander effect, people ask the same haunting question: Why didn't anyone do anything? It's a way of distancing ourselves from the situation, of placing the blame on a nameless, faceless group of strangers. But the real question, the one that cuts deeper and reveals something uncomfortable about human nature, is this: why didn't you do anything? Because the most dangerous thought in any emergency isn't hatred, fear, or cruelty. It's the quiet, seemingly harmless belief that someone else will step in, someone else will make the call, someone else will take responsibility. That single thought, repeated silently in dozens of minds, creates a moment where nobody acts and crises spiral out of control. The bystander effect isn't just a psychological phenomenon to be studied in textbooks or recreated in experiments. It's a mirror, reflecting the choices we make when the world stops and stares. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that in moments of crisis, action is not guaranteed. It must be chosen. And ultimately, it becomes a test of who you are, whether you'll wait for someone else to move, or whether you'll be the one who steps forward when it matters most.